What is going on, everybody? This is Skyhound, also known as Geek Detective Pierce. And today I am actually going to be pulling a little bit of double duty, if you will. Excuse the pun. Um, so, as I mentioned recently, I am going to be covering the entire Brosnan era of 007. Since that is actually the one that I grew up with, I know that some of you guys likely grew up watching, Sean Connery, Timothy Dalton, and, the others who have played 007 in the past. And if you noticed, I also mentioned about two actors who were in um, 007, at least for Brosnan. The case for Mr. Vincent Schiavelli, who was in the second film that I'll be discussing about later on. But for those of you guys who watched Desmond Llewellyn, God rest his soul, for the entire Bond franchise, I want to know in the comments, what was it about Mr. Llewellyn's performance that you guys enjoyed the most? What film did you think he did well in? I'd love to hear your thoughts about that in the comments. But anyway, let's get into this quick overview of Goldeneye, which is not just the start of the Brosnan era, but also it really brought into the forefront again um, 007 after a long hiatus. And what I liked about this one is the fact that we also have Sean Bean, who fans later learn plays a few other characters like sometime down the line after, his brief tenure for the James Bond franchise. However, I also want to mention one other actress, Famke Jen. Give me a moment, guys. Famke Jensen. Sorry, I just had the last name. I knew I was going to mess it up, but Famke Jensen, who was the femme fatale in this film, and obviously for those of us who watched the three X-Men films, you see where I'm going with this. I'm obviously going to be talking about Jean Grey, but she also played another. She also played a villain again in a different take on Hansel and Gretel, and obviously with that particular take, for those of you guys who have watched it, Jeremy Renner, who obviously fans recognize as Hawkeye from the Marvel Cinematic Universe, was also in this film. But anyway, I'm just highlighting some of the other films that some of these actors have played. But we get the iconic dam scene where Bond is trying to infiltrate and basically get the secrets to this device that's referred to as Goldeneye. But, excuse me, but by the time he gets there, the enemy obviously is already several steps ahead. Again, this is with regards to the Cold War. The communists are still trying to assert their power and all of that, but eventually we get 007 meeting up with his other with the other agent 006 played by Sean Bean. They're both trying to basically infiltrate, get what they need, and then get out. But unfortunately for them, they eventually get caught, and they're in this one room full of explosive gas tanks. And the one thing that I'll just have to kind of go through the brief summary here. Basically, they infiltrate a chemical weapons factory called Archangel, and unfortunately, when 006 gets caught and supposedly killed, James is forced to have to not just destroy the site, but also escape with a stolen aircraft. Of course, this was back in 1986. 9 years later, after the Soviet Union got dissolved, basically Bond has to attempt to prevent the thievery of a Tiger attack helicopter during a military demonstration in Monte Carlo, but unfortunately he's unsuccessful. However, there is one, how do I put this? Oh, yes. There's an interesting moment where the device that's referred to as Goldeneye creates a link to a satellite that eventually causes an EMP to effectively knock out anything within a certain radius, all electronics. And that also includes Russian aircraft that were trying to knock out the satellite. As a result, Bond has to go to St. Petersburg, and he meets his CIA contact. But as a result of that, he learns that there's a former KGB agent that he knows, and he's asking him to strike a meeting with Janice. Unfortunately, he learns that his old partner actually faked his own death back over at Archangel. But we also learned that his former, I don't know if I would say partner, states that during the time when the Soviets were around, his parents, Yanis's parents, not Yanis, Trevelyan, his family was, of course, was betrayed by the Brits. And obviously he's there for revenge. But with regards to the stolen Tiger attack helicopter, Bond obviously gets stuck with Natalia Simonova, who was one of the survivors. And one of the moments, I know that I'm kind of bouncing around here since I did watch it, but I'm having trouble, but I didn't actually summarize it. Basically, the character that Famke Janssen plays is Xenia Onatop. She actually is one that practically gets off with squeezing her, I guess I'd say, captives to death pretty much. I wouldn't say like in a strangling manner, but she does crush them to the point where not only that they're not able to breathe, but eventually, I guess it's another way of like crushing them to death is a better way of putting it. And there's a moment where Bond is trying to, like, I guess I could say, like, find some information. And he actually goes to basically this one bathhouse, and he gets ambushed um, by Onatop. Of course, that's later on when he finds out that 006 was actually alive, and then he gets knocked out. I'm kind of bouncing around again. But anyway, both Bond and Natalia do manage to escape from having. I mean, the helicopter does get destroyed, but they manage to escape from it. Natalia obviously mentions about Goldeneye and one of the fellow programmers, Boris Grishenko. And they find out that not only is there one, but there's a second. And unfortunately, when the Russian Minister of Defense, Dmitry Mishkin, manages to try to get information out of both Bond and Natalia, unfortunately, Mishkin gets betrayed by Uramov. So Bond eventually commandeers a tank to pursue them, both Uramov and Natalia. But eventually, they manage to. Eventually, Bond manages to find his way through and get rid of Uramov. So by the time he gets over to Cuba, Boris supposedly is Natalia's friend, and he manages to how to put this? They're able to trace the location to where the second satellite might be within Cuba. However, by the time they manage to make a second attempt at trying to find the satellite, they get shot down, and that's when Onatop attempts to try and get rid of Bond after the plane gets shot down. But Bond manages to get the upper hand and shoot the helicopter that Onatop is actually strapped to. As a result, she gets caught between some trees and eventually dies from strangulation, ironically. There's a line that, I mean, as dirty as it sounds, it still kind of gives me a good chuckle, where Bond is telling Natalia she always did enjoy a good squeeze. As silly as it sounds, both of them manages to make their way into the place where the satellite is being housed, which is actually several feet below where that lake is. And obviously, Natalia is really pissed off that Boris would actually be, betraying her and all that. And there's a moment where Bond actually points out that how did I put this? It's been a while since I've watched the whole thing, but I should have made notes on this. Anyway, Boris is constantly keeps trying to break through Natalia's little hack, and obviously By the time um, Bond actually manages to knock the exploding pen from Boris, eventually um, a firefight ensues, and not only is the how do I put this? In order to prevent the satellite from actually sending the signal out, Bond goes to basically jam the gears where the antenna is, and that disrupts the alignment. Only briefly. As a result, um, Trevelyan tries to intercept him, and as a result, as the two fight, they both get entangled over at the tip of the antenna. But Bond eventually gets the drop on him, and as a result, eventually the satellite gets destroyed, and Trevelyan is like really like banged up after the long fall towards the base of that artificial lake. And as a result, once the satellite gets destroyed, it drops down, eventually killing Trevelyan. Boris, unfortunately, despite his attempts at trying to survive, doesn't realize that as the base gets destroyed, there's some canisters of coolant, and that eventually freezes him, and he's pretty much killed by being frozen to death. Natalia obviously comes to Bond's aid by commandeering a helicopter, and eventually both of them manage to get picked up by Wade and the U.S. Marines, who escort them to Guantanamo. Now, while I was kind of going a little bit quick on this, I'm just kind of giving a general overview. There is a documentary, roughly an hour, 90 minutes, a few minutes more, with regards to the Goldeneye video game that comes out. It's referred to as Golden Era. If you want to look that up, that is actually you can find it on Tubi if you're using that streaming service. However, I did some digging around on my end. You can also find that on Amazon Video. And what that basically covers is the development of the game that also not only became very popular with most of us gamers, but if you played it, whether it's the original or the reskinned one with Daniel Craig on it, I know people have their mixed feelings on it. This documentary basically covers the development from beginning to end, what got it so popular, the tournaments that were happening around there. For those of you who have played the GoldenEye game, I am curious. Leave it in the comments below if you like. What was your favorite modes that you like to play? Which characters, did you like playing the most? Favorite weapons, favorite moments. I'll tell you this much. I couldn't even get past the second stage, and I was just, like not into first-person shooters as much. But overall, if I had to give my general thoughts on GoldenEye itself, while it is the first attempt at trying to bring Bond back, I will say that even though the visuals look dated, objectively, story wise, I would say that it's a really good attempt at trying to reinvigorate the character, try to give some additional backstory in terms of like supposedly what happened after he was away for so long. Pierce Brosnan, his performance as 007, this one was actually pretty good. And for Sean Bean to play a villain in this case, even though it was very brief, I know there's a few other characters he's played. Most would just cite him playing Boromir in Lord of the Rings. I get that, but the way how he did 006 as a rogue agent, if you will, that to me, I think, was enough to point out that even the most seasoned agents can sometimes crack if you know their pressure points, if you will. Now, as for Famke Janssen, who played Xenia Onatop, the femme fatale in this case, I know there's a few others who are into those types of characters. Someone once asked me like why I'm sometimes into certain crazy characters because, well, she played Jean Grey, and for those of us who are X-Men fans know the background to an extent of this character. She unfortunately goes a little bit nuts down the line. She played the villain very well, and I like the way how when it comes to both Bond and Natalia, the way how both tend to play off of each other. We see the difference in terms of viewpoints of Russian versus British in terms of how to approach things. And the fact is that, how to put this, despite the fact that she is a smart woman in a man's world, the fact that she's able to outplay and outmaneuver, as well as outthink a former ally and see into his mindset, if you will. Boris is essentially a narcissist and a bit of a psychopath. And Natalia actually is able to not just figure out his gameplay with how he, tries to hack things, but she's able to, at least in this case, towards the end of the film, be a few steps ahead. And by the time Boris tries to, break her encryption, it's already too late. So the interesting thing with this film is that I didn't actually get a chance to watch the entire thing till sometime later on. With the next 3 films that I'll be summarizing here, in this case, I'm about to jump into Tomorrow Never Dies. What really got me into this one was the fact that it really addresses how crazy the media can be, especially in terms of manipulating narratives. And there's definitely some irony that I sometimes cite not as often, but this does speak to a degree to how crazy, not just the entertainment industry, but the media in general has become. So, getting into Tomorrow Never Dies, we get to the obvious opening scene of a stealth ship that is stalking um, a British fleet or a British ship that supposedly is crossing into Chinese territorial waters. And obviously, we have a couple of Chinese fighters telling the Brits, "You guys are trespassing. You need to turn back now, or we will be forced to open fire." However, this stealth ship sends out a torpedo drill, if you will, which not only will eventually strike the ship itself, but also they destroy the two Chinese fighters at the same time. But prior to that, we see Bond infiltrating a arms black market and basically as MI6 is trying to identify each of the players and the buyers. The one thing that was pretty clear is that how to put this? Since it has to do with Russians, they find that one of the weapons has to do with nukes that are strapped to a fighter jet, and one of the observers is asking. I mean, Bond is pretty much asking one of the observers on MI6, "Do you see what I'm looking at?" He's like, "Of course I see what you're looking at." And then it takes him roughly about, I'd say maybe 20 to 30 seconds to realize, oh shoot. Then he realizes that the nukes that that's on the plane that James is looking at is actually nuclear. But prior to that, they have someone fire a missile to wipe out the entire arms bazaar. But by the time James is actually doing his job, one of the admirals is asking M, what the hell is he doing? And M turns to him in a scornful manner and simply states, his job. So he trashes the whole place, gets into the jet with the nukes, and obviously there's another fighter that is right on his tail, and that's right after he knocks out the co-pilot behind as he pilots the one with the nukes. Eventually, Bond manages to get the jet right below the one that's tailing him. And after he ejects the backseat driver, if you will, destroying the other jet, he then asks the Admiral where he would like his nukes delivered. And he does that as a bit of a joke. And obviously, the mission's a success. But again, going back to the quick summary I had earlier, the media mogul known as Elliot Carver decides to use the encoder that was obtained at the Arms Bazaar by Gupta, who was an American. He uses his work to eventually basically provoke war between China and the UK. And the attack that I summarized earlier was just phase one. So Carver pretty much is pointing out that he uses his attempt at creating bad press to pressure people into like not just doing his work, but at the same time, what happened earlier that I kind of narrated was that the HMS Devonshire was sent off course because of that encoder used by Henry Gupta. And Mr. Stamper is the one who was commanding that stealth ship that I mentioned earlier. So basically, Carver is trying to state that, the Chinese sunk that ship and is supposedly trying to, and China is supposedly trying to provoke a war between the Brits and the Chinese. So Bond is actually sent out to investigate Carver and his company. So before we get any further on that, I should have mentioned this earlier. If you like this, please hit the like and subscribe button. It would really help me try to at least slowly grow my channel, even though for the most part I am still a beginner. And anyway, getting back to my quick summary here, Bond is sent over, and prior to heading over to investigate Carver, Q comes in and tells Bond about, the new car that he's using, which is obviously a BMW. The one thing that I find really amusing is when he mentions about the phone, that it had about some of the usual tricks that it has. A fingerprint scanner. It also has a stunner that elicits, I think, 10,000 volts. I can't remember. It's been a while since I've watched it. But the one part that Q said he was really proud of was the remote control for the car. And he's trying to demonstrate it to James, tap twice for it to start, and then, trying to figure out how to move it. And then obviously Bond, being his usual arrogant self, he's like, let's see how she responds to my touch. And then as he's, playing around with it, just to annoy Q, he's like, I think we pretty much understand each other. And Q's like, grow up, 007. And the amusing thing about this is that the car itself is voice activated and all of that. Q's telling him, thought you'd prefer listening to a female voice. So anyway, Bond eventually gets to the media company that Carver has, and he eventually meets up with Carver, and Bond has to go under the guise of a banker. So Carver is simply asking him, "Tell me, Mr. Bond, how is the how is the banks responding to the current crisis?" And Bond simply states to him, that um, that his stocks are supposedly doing pretty well. And we also get the introduction to another character by the name of Wei Lin. But the one thing that I find interesting is that um, when Bond finds the eventual wife of Carver, Paris, he was actually an ex-girlfriend of his. She is obviously not surprised to see him and is obviously pissed off. So when he's like, after he gets, as the term goes, bitch slapped by Paris, he's like, "Was it something I said?" She is quick to respond and tell him, "How about the words, 'I'll be right back'?" And he's trying to worm his way out of the situation, stating something came up, and she's like, "Something always comes up." There's a point later on, before we get to Carver kind of like going on the air. Stamper points out that something is off with this so-called banker, and even Carver himself finds it strange that someone, basically another banker, seems to be interested in his work. And the one thing, before I go any further on here, there's a moment in the film where Bond is asking Carver about not just about the satellite, but also how he's basically asking Carver, what if you were using, a satellite to not just control the media, but also, say, manipulate governments or send a ship off course? And it is at that moment that Carver is able to pick up on certain quips, like the way how Bond is stating certain questions. And eventually, when Paris is actually asking Bond, "Do you still sleep with a gun under your pillow?" This obviously not blows James's cover, but at the same time, it also points out that Carver knows that Paris is actually lying to him. So Bond eventually gets escorted by Stamper and some of his henchmen. Well, some of Stamper's henchmen, in this case, I misspoke here. And despite Bond actually getting beat for a moment, he obviously alerts Stamper that, something's amiss here. And while Carver is actually going on about what went on in China with the sinking of the British ship, the Devonshire, Bond actually manages to cut him off, if you will. This in turn not only hurts Carver's ego when he learns that the media is kind of like mocking him, saying that during his time to like announce his media company, it got cut off abruptly. And Paris is eventually sent to try and get some information out of Bond because earlier when they rendezvoused, Paris flat out told him, I already made my bed, you no longer sleep in it, which is her way of saying, go screw yourself, I'm no longer interested in you anymore. But when she meets up with him, she pretty much is asking Bond, despite, their previous brief relationship, she's asking him, did I get too close? And Bond is straight out telling her, yeah, you obviously did. And right after that, Gupta points out to Carver that he discovered something. And it's that quote that I mentioned earlier when Paris asks James, do you still sleep with a gun under your pillow? He then points out, I think it's time that I make an appointment with the doctor for my wife. This doctor actually played by one moment the late Vincent Schiavelli. And I will have to ask you guys later on after I finish this quick review for both films. But anyway, that guy played the doctor referred to as Kaufman, a professional assassin. And by the time the henchmen are trying to get the box, prior to that, James gets a call from Carver, and he's asked, and prior to the whole thing, he manages to break into the company and steal the encoder. But after he does, and despite, Waylon being able to get what she needs, Bond eventually gets called by Carver, and he's asking, how'd you get his number? And Carver states to him, I believe you have two things. I believe you have something that belongs to me, Mr. Bond. And Bond tries to fake, ignorance, saying, I have no idea what you're talking about. And he's like, what are you even asking anyway? And Carver simply states, number one, the encoder that you stole, and second is my wife. And when I was rewatching this, though, a few weeks ago, in one of the notes, when I was watching this on Amazon Prime, they stated that this is one of the few films where Bond actually is basically having an affair with someone who is married. And when Dr. Kaufman arrives, he already killed Paris. So by the time Bond comes in, Kaufman is kind of explaining to him, He's just trying to do his job. And Kaufman is asked, what's going on? And then the henchmen are telling him, there's something in the car, we can't get into it. And so Kaufman asks Bond, this is a little embarrassing. There appears to be something in your car, and, my men aren't unable to open it. He's like, yeah, I might be able to help you with that. And he tries to hand him the phone. He's like, trying to like guide doctor, like you press, this number here, and he's like, no, I'll do it. Yeah. And so Bond gives him the numbers to supposedly activate the unlocking mechanism. But what he's actually doing is causing the stunner to activate, which eventually stuns Dr. Kaufman enough. And there's the obvious line of him stating, wait, I'm just a professional doing a job. And Bond is being apathetic at this point. He's like, uh-huh, so am I, before he ends him right then and there. So eventually we get to Bond trying to get back into the car. And the one thing and there's something about this that I really enjoyed, and it has to do with not just the henchman not being able to get in, but by the time he turns it on, there's a few gadgets that I found really cool. One of them having to be not just is not is Bond not I'm sorry, I'm kind of bouncing around here. Not only is Bond able to reinflate the tires after he after the henchmen used those spikes to flatten it, but also there's a small little mini saw that pops out in the middle of the BMW symbol when they try to use those tense wires, that's used for bridges and the like, to try and stop them. But eventually, Bond manages to, how to put this? Again, it's been a while since I've watched this. But Bond manages to get over to Okinawa with an old friend of his, Jack Wade. And he finds out that one of the encoder that he grabbed was actually messed with. So he comes across Wei Lin, and that's after he manages to find the ship that went down, and he finds that one of their missiles is missing. So by the time both Bond and Wei Lin resurface, they both get caught by Stamper and his henchmen after Wei Lin supposedly had a ride waiting for them. So both managed to get caught. Both unfortunately got caught, and they're over in Saigon. And eventually, Wei Lin kind of figures out, what she finds out what Carver's eventually doing, and Bond is a little bit late to the party on that part in figuring out what's going on. But both realize that their governments are being played for fools by a media mogul. And basically, Carver's plan with the missile is to use it against China to spark a war between the Brits and the Chinese. And there's a point where, after Bond and Weyland escape, he finds out where she has a hidden secret base. And there's a point in the film that I find really fun where Bond is suggesting that I'll send the message, you get the weapons, and we see this amusing grin by Weyland, played by Michelle Yeoh. I should have mentioned that. She's like, "Yeah, good luck with that." And Bond sees that all the keys are in Chinese, and at this point, he's like, "Okay, you know what? I'll let you do the message." And eventually, she manages to um, deduce and pinpoint where the stealth ship is supposed to be. And by the time they do manage to get in, there's a few interesting exchanges in this film that I actually like. And it has to do with when Bond gets confronted by Carver, and he actually has a gun dug up to his head, and he's basically telling him, you can't shoot the missile without him. And Carver's stating to him, and it seems you can't actually resist any woman in my possession. And when Gupta is proven to be of no use because he's just had a backup to using the missile, Carver is simply telling Bond, unlike you, I have a backup plan. But he doesn't realize that Bond is actually a few steps ahead. So when the stealth ship gets destroyed, not destroyed, gets spotted through the explosion that he carefully placed within some gas tanks, eventually the Brits manage to catch wind of it, and eventually they alert the Chinese Air Force. So Weyland manages to get into the engine room and disable the engines, while Bond has to eventually confront Carver. And there's this one quote that I think is either overstated or not stated enough. And it's this type of irony that I actually like, because, kudos to the writers on this. And when Carver thinks he has the upper hand, Bond manages to actually activate the drill torpedo. And he's telling Carver, I may have some breaking news for you, Elliot. And by the time he manages to hold him long enough, Bond states, I guess from my understanding, the cardinal rule when it comes to the media. You forgot the first rule of mass media, Elliot. Give the people what they want. And eventually, Elliot gets shredded by the drill torpedo. And what I like about that quote has to do with the fact that majority of the time, the customer is mostly right compared to the useful idiot consumers of today. Because if you're going to insult the intelligence of your audience, why should they bother supporting the product or the brand? especially the veteran fans that grew up watching, you know, said things. And yes, tastes may change, but the fact is, if you're going to alienate 90% of your customers, the money eventually is going to stop flowing. It is not endless. And Bond was basically pointing out to Carver that he is a fool and he let his ego get the best of him. But anyway, getting towards the end of the film here, we see Stamper trying to tell Bond to either stop what you're doing or I'm going to kill your friend. But what he doesn't realize is that earlier, Bond already had placed some mini bombs at the exhaust port of the missile that was going to be used. So eventually, when the missile does get engaged, Bond manages to release the lever that loosens the missile and crush one of Stamper's legs. As a result, Bond is able to escape and try to save Wei Lin, and obviously Stamper gets blown to bits. And eventually, as Bond and Wei Lin are able to escape from the wreckage, they decide to lay low, despite another ship from the British trying to look for them. So, with this sequel to GoldenEye, I will admit that while it does address the lunacy of the media and the constant need to manipulate narratives, if you will, I think that this one actually, while the style of the film is a little dated to a degree, I think that this film does address, and I guess I could say predict, the mindset of corporate media in general, in that the ones who keep pushing that, oh, the reason why this stuff is happening is because of Russians. Well, when you have those who are supporting evil and yet said evil is calling out, your BS, if you will, it pretty much proves that sometimes certain evil characters, when they're written well, despite them being evil, do point out an obvious flaw that the protagonist obviously is trying to keep hidden. Now, depending on what you watch, I'm sure most of you guys have come across this all the time. What I like about this one is, besides the writing and the direction that the film was trying to go at, I think that there comes a point in time that when you forget your purpose, which is basically acting and entertaining people, eventually most people are just going to be like, this is who I used to watch back in the day, and now he's kind of gone off the rails. Like, what the heck happened? And to a point, I get it. However, as most people have pointed out and reminded me, I may not agree with said actor or actress's politics, if you will, because most people have media derangement syndrome, and this film kind of addresses that, but I will still try to defend to an extent the person's um, rights to saying it. However, that doesn't mean that we are not going to document it and then use it against them. So, objectively, with this one, I will say that the story, I'd give it at least an 8 out of 10. Even though it is straightforward, there are still some parts that I think could use a little bit of work. The villains were pretty good, but in terms of which one I would say is memorable, I think that Elliot Carver, despite being a media mogul, like he was an okay villain. The reasons behind it was pretty straightforward. Now, in terms of a threat, I will say that it's not as menacing compared to some of the previous ones. But take, for example, what was it? Give me a second. Trevelyan, for example. He was a former 00 agent. He was a friend of Bond. And he fakes his death out of spite that basically the British government betrayed his family, and so he defects over to the other side. The difference is that Bond, to an extent, understands that yes, his government does have problems. Yes, he is a blunt instrument of the government, but he still tries to do what he needs to, even at the cost of his own life. And yet, supposedly, when Bond is looking at it from his former friend's point of view, he unfortunately, as some would say, didn't get the memo. Now, in terms of the plot between Goldeneye and Tomorrow Never Dies, if I had to say which one was more iconic story-wise, I'd have to lean more towards Goldeneye. With Tomorrow Never Dies, I mean, like, yes, you do have the Chinese communists and their way of handling things, but if you look at it from, at least in terms of a threat standpoint, Goldeneye likely has the edge compared to that. Characterization wise, I will say that the ones that are the most memorable, at least for me, on the villain side, Goldeneye gets it in terms of villains. Tomorrow Never Dies, they try to at least make a credible attempt in terms of using the media as a tool to control governments, which kind of hits close to home nowadays. I'd say that objectively it's somewhat good. With Goldeneye, you're using secretive tech to basically blind your opponent and then basically pressure them into doing what you have to. Now, which one actually I think is more believable between the two? I will say that subjectively, in terms of which plot is more believable, I would say Tomorrow Never Dies is more believable compared to Goldeneye. Now, why would I say that the plot in Tomorrow Never Dies is more believable? Because if you look at how things are today and then try to put in perspective of how the main plot in Tomorrow Never Dies is to have media tear down, government agencies and, um, law and order. That is basically what the media does. They are deceptive and try to spin a narrative to fit their needs, regardless of which side you're on. I think that if I was to rate the two, objectively, I'd give Goldeneye a 8 out of 10. Subjectively, as an average 007 fan, at best a 9 out of 10. For Tomorrow Never Dies, objectively, I'm going to give that one at least a 7 out of 10. And then subjectively, it deserves, from my observation, a 9 out of 10. And I know I'm just kind of like doing the whole quick summary off the top of my head memory type of analysis here. But again, I'm trying to do a little bit of double duty in summarizing both of these films, giving my general thoughts and the like. But again, I am curious, for those of you guys who played GoldenEye back in the day, what did you enjoy about it? What didn't you like about it? What were your favorite levels? And I have to cite the multiplayer aspect, especially for those of us who played it on the Nintendo 64, one of my favorite game consoles during the 90s. I know that there's been a lot of tournaments for those of you guys who played it. If you guys played it in a tournament, what was it like? I want to know. Leave it in the comments below. What was your favorite weapon? Who was your favorite villain, Bond villain? What were your favorite modes? I know there's a lot of hilarious stories that I've heard on the internet about, what conditions you guys try to use in order to win. But yeah, again, this is just my general take and quick summary of both GoldenEye and Tomorrow Never Dies. If you guys liked it, do hit the like and subscribe button. And in a few short moments, I will be going over the second half of the Brosnan Era with The World Is Not Enough and the final film of Brosnan, which is Die Another Day. But anyway, if you guys liked it, hit the like and subscribe button. And again, if you guys enjoyed this, feel free to share it amongst others. And of course, I'd like to hear your general thoughts. What did you like about GoldenEye? What didn't you like about it? If you've never watched it, I'd definitely recommend it. Same case with Tomorrow Never Dies. If you like it, what was great, what was not great. And also, I will have to say again, if you want to know, what the GoldenEye game was, how it started, how did it leave its mark, why was it so popular, and why, the film GoldenEye itself, kickstarted the 007 franchise, I highly recommend taking a look at the documentary known as Golden Era. Again, I mentioned it earlier at the start of the stream. You can check it out on Tubi, or you can also check it out on Amazon Video. But with that being said, this has been Skyhound, also known as Geek Detective Pierce. And as always, stay humble, stay sane, and I'll see you guys in the next one shortly. Peace.